Canada had a front row seat to the Donald Trump show in 2016. What would Trump 2.0 mean for us and the rest of the world? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. A recent Angus Reid poll found that 2/3 of Canadians believe Trump will be bad or terrible for Canada. Meanwhile, in the few weeks Kamala Harris has been in the race, she has jumped ahead in the polls. But polls don't win elections. Our unpublished vote question asks, which candidate in the U.S. election will be better for Canada? Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, or unsure? You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote. And don't forget to email your MP afterwards using our tool to tell them why you think what you do. All comments on the unpublished.ca website will be entered into a draw for a one-year membership to unpublished.ca. And starting us off today, Warren Kinsella, political strategist and former advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chretien. And Warren, you're helping out the Harris campaign right now, so that's how you're leaning?
Yeah, there's kind of a hint there in the background. Yes, I'm down here in the United States, and with my partner and I, we've been knocking on doors for the Democrats, attending Democratic rallies, going to Democratic offices in different states. And they are in pretty good spirits. They are feeling pretty positive and optimistic about their chances. But, you know, those numbers you just pointed out, I've seen those before. I was here 8 years ago helping out Hillary Clinton, and she was ahead in national polls as well. What matters down here, as you know, is how people are doing in swing states, you know, those 6 or 7 states that go back and forth between the two main parties. And right now, she is competitive in a way that Joe Biden was not, but she's not to home base just yet. The Democrats have to work harder if they want to beat Donald Trump.
Yeah, Trump in his first term didn't know much about governing, which led to a lot of chaos and endless battles. Do you expect more of the same if he did win, or does he have better handlers this time around?
Well, one of the things that's helped the Democrats down here is, you know, certainly everybody in the United States knows that Donald Trump can be a total maniac, you know, a monkey with a machine gun, as I call him. But, you know, what will he do when he gets in power? He doesn't talk about policy. He much prefers to attack personalities and say awful things about Kamala Harris and others. So, you know, what has happened is there's been a leak of what is called Project 2025. And this is a document put together by former Trump staffers, hardcore Republicans, MAGA Republicans, about what a Donald Trump government would do. You know, last time in 2016, when I was helping Hillary, what was apparent, like we were shocked that he won, but he was shocked that he won too. And so the institutions of the US government really kind of limited a lot of the things that he wanted to do. He talked big, but there was no follow through. They've learned that lesson. They're getting ready for power, and Project 2025 is the blueprint for what they will do. And we're talking mass deportations, massive politicization of the U.S. Bureaucracy, total change to U.S. foreign policy, becoming much more insular and protectionist. Those are the things that Democrats need to alert people to down here, because I believe if they do that, they will win the presidential.
You know, since Kamala Harris entered the race, there is new air around the Democrats, but it is early. Can it sustain?
Yeah, and that is the key question. They're running a great campaign. She's got more money than God. She's actually had the most successful fundraising effort in the history of the United States. Just nearly $1 billion in the very short time since she became the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. The party's united behind her. There's no dissent and so on. But, you know, Ed, I was out on Saturday door knocking for her, and I said to the people that I was working with, do we have any literature to give to people? All we had was a single sheet of paper with printing on one side of it and 3 bullets. Like, that does not get you through a presidential campaign. The thing that I've heard over and over down here is, I don't like Donald Trump. I kind of like Kamala Harris. I like what I see. What is she going to do? And because it's not enough down here just to oppose Donald Trump, they want to hear what she is planning on doing. And the Democrats really need to do a rollout, because, you know, sooner or later, the Republicans are going to define her as, you know, as what they want to, which is a coastal elite with a hidden agenda.
We Canada, that is, are right next to our largest trading partner. And which Canadian leader would defend Canadian interests better when having to deal with Trump?
Well, I mean, Trudeau is the guy who wants the answer to be him. I believe that's why he's stuck around. You and I both know, and we've talked about how he's been behind by as many as 20 points for more than a year. And I think what he's been waiting for is a Trump victory. I think his plan was to say to the Canadian voters, look, do you really want Donald Trump in power in Washington and Pierre Poilievre in power in Ottawa? You need a progressive to offset Trump. Well, that all falls apart if Kamala Harris wins. I believe that she will at the end of the day. They're running a much more imaginative, much more effective campaign than Hillary did in 2016. But I think that is what Trudeau's been waiting for, is being the offset to Trump. At the end of the day, is Poilievre going to be strong enough to oppose Trump? I suspect he will be. If you look at the Chinese EV story that came out in the past few weeks, the Americans announced in May that they were going to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Who was the first Canadian leader to say he would do likewise? Pierre Poilievre. It was only Justin Trudeau who this week said that he would do the same thing. So I think at the end of the day, Poilievre will do fine. He will find things to disagree with whoever is president. Because the one thing, Ed, to keep in mind, whoever wins down here is going to be protectionist. Protectionism is a very favorable political point of view to have in the United States of America. So whoever is there, Democrats or Republicans, Canada is going to be facing a challenge.
We talk about Trudeau, and you mentioned that, obviously a Trump presidency is good for Trudeau, but considering Trump's tendencies toward people he feels slighted him, and Justin Trudeau fits that bill, wouldn't you think he'd be out for retribution?
Oh, for sure. And, he is capable of it. Last time, at the end of the day, the issue that was most alarming to us was the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And Chrystia Freeland, give her full credit, did a really good job in wrestling that file to the ground and getting basically the same deal out of the Americans, but with a different name. And, letting Trump think that he'd had some big victory over Canada and Mexico. He really didn't. So it is possible to deal with him. But yeah, he does respond emotionally like, a lot of unstable people do, quite frankly. And, I think at the end of the day, Poilievre's probably going to think, well, I'll be better at dealing with him. But, dollars to donuts, there'll become a moment where Prime Minister Poilievre is going to be insulted in some way by Donald Trump. But again, I don't think Donald Trump's going to win. I think Harris is going to pull this off.
All right. But, is democracy at risk under a second Trump presidency?
100%. Absolutely. Ukraine is gone. Ukraine is gone. Israel, I think everybody that I talk to in Israel, I talk to a lot of people, they feel that they are in peril as well. Taiwan is gone. And that Latvia and some of those states in Eastern Europe, they are gone as well. Putin's got his eye on them. He will do what Putin wants. He will look the other way with, what G wants. Like, it will be a very different world. It'll be a much more dangerous world than the one we've got now. And it's a very dangerous world right now. Donald Trump is a real and present danger to all of us, not just to Americans or Ukrainians or Israelis. He is a real threat. And people need to wake up to it down here in the United States and around the world.
Warren, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks, my friend.
Warren Kinsella is a political strategist and former advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chretien. Continuing our discussion on the prospect of Trump 2.0, our next guest wrote just a week ago, Canada needs to be ready for anything. Colin Robertson is a former Canadian diplomat and senior advisor to Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and he joins us now. And Colin, have you ever seen a person with the criminal convictions under his belt enjoy such support?
No, it's extraordinary. The Americans from time to time deviate to an extent that it leaves you scratching your head and thinking maybe they really are different than we are. And this is certainly a classic example. Trump has something that comes from the Huey Long School, the Father Coughlin. There is within the United States that quirky side, which often veers into criminality, which I think is certainly the case with Trump.
You know, in terms of dealing with Canada, how could Trump impact this country economically if he wins in November?
Well, if he imposes, as he's suggesting he's going to do, 100% tariffs on all sorts of products, even if they are aimed at the Chinese, we become collateral damage, as is always the case, as we found when he was president on steel and aluminum and other products. We have to go down and make our case, as we are doing as we speak, as to why the relationship between Canada and the United States is special, and they want to avoid sideswiping us because it will cost them jobs. And that's what we talk about, jobs, because we don't have money and we don't have votes, but we can talk about jobs that we create as a result of our mutually beneficial trade and investment.
Well, we saw that, you know, going back to the first Trump presidency when he imposed those tariffs, and it ended up costing Americans more because
absolutely,
the tariffs
because
were put on
again,
stuff.
we are so deeply integrated. It goes back to our original free trade agreement with autos back in 1965, negotiated by Lester Pearson and Lyndon Johnson, and then of course extended under Mulroney in the original Canada-U.S. free trade agreement, and then which morphed into the NAFTA, and more recently, when Trump was president, the renegotiation of the NAFTA into what we call the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, which comes up for review in a year and a half, and we've got to be prepared for that, because who's ever the president, there will be pressure from Congress to look at certain aspects of the agreement. Again, maybe not aimed at Canada, but perhaps directed towards Mexico, where there's still concerns about the enforcement of labor and environmental provisions within the NAFTA in the case of Mexico.
NATO has been a whipping boy, and it's no surprise that Trump questions its use and complains a lot of members, including Canada, don't spend 2% GDP on defense. You know, if Trump wins, do you think that could be the end of the organization?
I hope not. I think there'll be enough support within Congress, and there's been an effort within Congress working with the Biden administration to prevent the president from being able to pull out of a treaty which has to be sanctioned and was sanctioned by the Senate back in 1949. And I think there probably are still enough Republican senators who would support this as vital to American security. But you raise a good question, and certainly that is the fear of the allies and should be concern of Canada, because while we have our own binational agreement, the NORAD, the NATO agreement was really the first, and the collective security agreement. If Trump decides to abandon that, then he may well take a look at NORAD and say, why am I doing this? Because we're paying, again, as he argues in the case of NATO, America is carrying the heaviest load, which is true, but certainly in the last decade and in the last couple of years, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the European allies have truly upped their game, and most of them now pass the 2%. We don't. We've committed, as you know, the Prime Minister, when he was down at the NATO summit, said we'll reach it in 2032, but we have yet to see the plan besides the talk of buying a dozen new submarines.
If NATO is either hindered or shut down or altogether because the U.S. pull out, what's that mean for the rest of the world?
Well, it means, certainly for the democracies and for the West, it means that we would have to try and come up with something. I think the Europeans, the British, the French, and the Germans, the Italians, and the Spanish would be inclined to try and keep a collective security arrangement intact. And that, of course, the French and the British do have a nuclear deterrent, which is really the backstop right now, because the United States is in a different league entirely than any other military in the world. Much more so than even the Russians or the Chinese. And the deterrent power of NATO is that nuclear shield that the Americans can provide right now. So if they were not, it would be difficult for us to sustain the deterrent capacity of NATO without the American presence.
You know, another organization that might feel the impact of a Trump presidency is the United Nations. And if that's the case, how does it continue on?
Oh, another good question, Ed. Remember, these organizations were all formed in post-war, Second World War situation with first Franklin Roosevelt and then Harry Truman, and then every president since then, saying that these are bedrocks of the American approach to a rules-based order, an American-designed rules-based order, the centerpiece being the United Nations, again, founded on the premise that peace is vital, and then backstopped with, after the Soviet Union became apparent as a challenge, backstopped by NATO and a web of other security agreements that the United States has, particularly in the Indo-Pacific now, and which Mr. Biden has made effort to revitalize and create some new ones, like the AUKUS involving Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and then the Quad with India and Japan and Australia and the United States, and then individual agreements with countries like the Philippines, Korea, and revitalizing the Japanese alliance.
How should a Canadian Prime Minister defend Canadian interest if Trump does win the election in November?
Well, I know it's a good question, but I think that the current government in January launched a effort at what they call a Team Canada effort, led by Trade Minister Mary Ng and Industry Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne, and working with our ambassador, Kirsten Hillman. They have been covering the United States and going beyond the Beltway, that is beyond Washington, into the states with whom are our biggest trading partners. And for 35 American states, Canada is their biggest trading export market. And we're reminding them of that, again, mutually important trade, which now amounts in Canadian dollars to something like $3.3 billion a day. It's extraordinary, the amount. We just 75% of what we export as a country goes to the United States. Our trading relationship with the United States roughly accounts for about a third of our gross domestic product. So it's very important for us, vital to our prosperity, and it pays the bills for our health care, our education, and housing, and anything else we want to do. So we've been working hard over the last few months. And in Halifax this week, Kirsten Hillman gave kind of a report card, and some of the statistics I thought were quite interesting. She said they've made over 500 representations to either Congress or legislators or governors. She said they've met with 42 governors, and that's impressive. So we're getting out and we're telling the Canadian story, and to a positive reception, whether there would be Republican or Democrat. And going back to your point about Donald Trump, he may become president, but he's sustained by a party that we will have met many of them, particularly the elected representatives, whether they be in Congress, the House of Representatives, or the Senate, or the 23 or 24 or 25 governors that are Republican.
Yeah, Project 2025 has been something that's sort of been bandied around. Is that something that concerns you looking forward?
Well, it's a fairly radical agenda, and I think that the people behind it, designed by the Heritage Foundation, a lot of the individuals involved were in the Trump administration and would be in a future Trump administration. So yes, we should be concerned. We know where they're coming from. We know where they want to go ideologically, particularly in social policy and economic policy. And there are parts of the Project 2025 we can live with, but there are parts of it that would give anybody concerned about sort of liberal rights and things some concern, and particularly reproductive health. And again, we've managed to avoid much of that in Canada because we've basically said this is up to our provinces. And I think that's allowed us to avoid a lot of the cultural wars that the United States has gone through.
Yeah, do you think democracy is at risk under a Donald Trump presidency the second time around?
Well, certainly there's a lot of American pundits who feel that the authoritarian instinct that Trump has demonstrated in the past will once again prevail. And the danger is it is Trump without any guardrails. In his first administration, he employed a number of generals who swore an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and truly practice it, as whether they're talking about Jim Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense, or H.R. McMaster, who was his national security advisor, or John Kelly, who was his chief of staff. These warriors truly believed in the Constitution of the United States and the supremacy of the elected branch, and would oppose and did oppose the dictatorial instincts, autocratic instincts of Mr. Trump. But whether that would hold true for another administration, I think is a big question mark, because part of the Project 2025 is to ensure that when the new administration starts, everybody has been vetted and they're all convinced that the last election was stolen from Mr. Trump, which there's no evidence to suggest that, despite all the various court cases that it went through, including courts presided over by Trump-appointed judges. There's just no evidence. But this myth is there, and you have to believe in that mythology before you would be allowed to join the administration. And keep in mind that the administration of the United States is fundamentally different from the Canadian civil service in that our civil service is a professional civil service up to the deputy minister level. In the American system, the president appoints everybody over, really for the senior executive, the director generals and above are political appointees and sanctioned usually by the Senate.
Colin, I want to thank you for joining us.
Ed, always a pleasure.
Colin Robertson is a former Canadian diplomat and senior advisor at Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Our Unpublished .io question asks you, which candidate in the U.S. election would be better for Canada? Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, or unsure? You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote. While Canada will get a front row view to Trump 2.0, the implications range farther. Elliot Tepper is a senior fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and he joins us now. And Elliot, did the first Trump presidency impact Canada's foreign affairs policy with other nations?
Actually, it impacted everybody everywhere. It was totally unexpected. As you know, Canada, I think, managed the quick adjustment better than other countries. In fact, other countries came to Canada to say, how are you handling this? Because to give the government the credit, it turned on a dime, set up a war room basically, and quickly opened up communications with Trump. But as you know, it was a very rocky time period for us. We had to renegotiate NAFTA. So NAFTA, which I'm going to call NAFTA 2.0, was successfully negotiated. And Donald Trump said, you know, the original NAFTA is the worst trade agreement ever, but the new NAFTA is the best one ever. So he became quite content with that. But after that, it was always touch and go, dealing with both the United States under Donald Trump, but also then managing our relationship with others. As you know, one of the key moments in that relationship came when at an international meeting, our prime minister was seen chatting amiably with other world leaders when they were all shaking their heads about how were we going to deal with Donald Trump. He didn't like that at all. So quite clearly, having a Donald Trump presidency makes an enormous difference. And the next Donald Trump presidency would be considerably different, because this time he is really ready if he becomes president in a way that he was not in his kind of accidental presidency the first time.
In terms of a second Trump presidency, he has maintained he could end the war between Russia and Ukraine in 24 hours. What would that mean for Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada?
Yes, one of the implications of a second Trump presidency is that foreign relations would be a key area. And in terms of Ukraine, it would be a disaster for Ukraine. He's made it very clear. Remember, he was impeached over trying to influence Ukraine to take steps which were inappropriate. So Ukraine is likely to lose its support from the United States, very possibly under a Trump presidency. NATO has been trying to Trump-proof the possibility by setting up bilateral deals. Many states within NATO now have 10-year agreements or so with Ukraine on a long-term basis, so no matter what happens with the U.S. But the reality is, well, without U.S. leadership, Ukraine would be in bad shape. And the way he would end the war in 24 hours is essentially to guarantee Ukrainian capitulation. This is not a prospect that anybody in Canada should welcome.
In terms of Russia and Canada, there have been some skirmishes in our north over ownership and passage. Do you see that accelerating under a Trump administration?
Yes, I think everything under a Trump administration involving our security would be affected one way or another. That certainly involves the North. Remember, China is also there. But I think if we could broaden this out slightly, Ed, I think one of the things that we should watch for in the forthcoming election, and it relates to Ukraine as well as to the other aspects of security, is that there will be massive intervention in the American electoral process, and also possibly in ours, with the number one leading contender for that is Russia. Donald Trump is desperate to become president because it might be the only way to stay out of jail. President Putin is desperate to help Donald Trump come in because it's his best single chance of actually winning an outright victory in Ukraine by pulling American support out. So I think keeping an eye out for disinformation and influence operations with these two sets of desperate circumstances are important, but it isn't the only one. We know that Iran is already accused of intervening. In fact, they've been accused recently of hiring a hitman to assassinate Donald Trump. They're still angry with him for his assassination of the key leader in the IRGC. But also after that, you've still got China, which will also very likely intervene, not necessarily on one side or another, but along with Iran, along with North Korea, to create a sense that democracy can't work, basically to weaken America by accentuating disorder and cleavages. So I think part of what we should be looking for in this upcoming campaign in terms of, Russia and others is definitely disinformation and influence operations.
Trump has talked an awful lot about decoupling the U.S. economy from China, bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. Could it be done? And if so, what's the impact?
Again, we have multiple impacts, keeping in mind that he did slap high tariffs on, and this opens up another subject, on China, and he did make major steps toward decoupling in a sense, which led to everybody, including us, to talk about nearshoring and friendshoring. We benefit from friendshoring. If you don't want to deal with China, hey, here we are. So that works out to our advantage. But it also means that Donald Trump is now promising a 10% tariff on everything, not just from China, but on everything coming into the United States. That, of course, is a 10% tax on the American public because they have to pay that. He's trying to pretend that isn't the case, but it is a tax on your own population. The possibility that under Trump, there would be an acceleration of tariffs on China, but also globally, is very much of concern to a country like Canada.
Trump seems to sidle up to autocrats, Erdogan, Orban, Putin, Jinping. Are we possibly looking at a new world order with a Trump presidency?
Yes, I think that's going to be a centerpiece of the Democrats' campaign to stop him from coming to power, is to stop an alliance of autocrats and the emergence basically of oligarchs and all autocrats, and that would be to everybody's disadvantage. So democracy on the ballot will be a slogan in the election, which has proven useful in the midterms, in the 2022 midterms. So very much so. I think the whole question of the future of democracy itself, the future role of the United States as an isolationist country, but also a weakened country, a country that doesn't want to lead, but also that cannot lead for the various reasons we're talking about. This is, as every election is considered the most important in our generation in their lifetime, but this clearly is going to be framed that way by the Democrats based on what you've just noted, but also it may be true.
I've asked my previous two guests, is democracy at risk? So I have to ask you, do you think democracy is at risk with a second Trump presidency?
Yes, I think that's well worth raising as a possibility. We're hearing an awful lot about Project 2025, which is, we have to quickly intercede here and say that's just one of several planning groups, but it's one that is putting together, as Tim Walz said, a playbook. And if you have a playbook, it's likely to be implemented. So the possibility that the kinds of drastic changes in the United States, which would actually create the deep state that Donald Trump falsely alleges does exist against him, it would come into existence if all of this actually got implemented and followed through. America, of course, has checks and balances, but the Supreme Court is a key element of that. And we're seeing that it is rather cooperative, let's say, with the kind of an agenda that Donald Trump would put forth under a 2025, that weakening of democracy and the creation of a deep state. You can't rely on the Supreme Court to stop it, apparently, unfortunately. And also the possibility that there will be a clean sweep, that is the House and the Senate, or the House or the Senate would come under Republican control, probably the Senate. That too would strengthen the hands of anyone who wants to implement the kinds of policies he's talking about and not talking about and promising he's not going to do. But yes, I think it's well worth considering this as a logical possibility.
Elliot, I want to thank you for joining us.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Ed.
Elliot Tepper is a senior fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Our unpublished vote question asks you, which candidate in the U.S. election will be better for Canada? Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, or unsure? You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote. I want to thank our guests today on the Unpublished Cafe, Warren Kinsella, Colin Robertson, and Elliot Tepper. And thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.